Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna start our lecture notes on Mesopotamia. I know this took a little longer to post up than I had wanted to, but it's up, and I will give you guys time to go ahead and write your lecture notes. All right, so just to go ahead and to start off, we left off introducing Mesopotamia. So just to go ahead and touch base with a couple of things that we had started to cover at that point. Mesopotamia literally means land between rivers in Greek. It's between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and this is where the majority of civilization started, and they all began to migrate into this area. Now, the main thing I want to go ahead and express and have you guys understand is that Mesopotamia is not like Egypt. It's not like any other civilization that we're going to cover. The Mesopotamia it's a centralized place, and its people live in different city-states. The city-states were all independent nations that went ahead and they continuously tried to take over one another. All right, so today, most of what used to be Mesopotamia is now considered Iraq, with parts of Iran, Syria, and Turkey. It was where the first civilization developed here. It was known as the Fertile Crescent, or the cradle of civilization, because of the type of not atmosphere, but the type of environment that they had. They all lived in this big green area that's over here on the little map on the bottom. The reason that it was called the Fertile Crescent is because of the two rivers that are here, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and all that silt that they had, the good ground that created good soil for growing crops, was known as the Fertile Crescent. It produced a lot of good crops for the area. The Sumerians were the first people to live in this area around 4000 BCE. Like I said, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. This was good for farming, and the irrigation system is something we're going to discuss a little bit more later on. And basically, it's a system where the water is able to filter itself and water the crops so that they grow abundantly. This led to a food surplus, which led to job specialization. Job specialization means that everyone didn't have to worry about farming every day or hunting every day or gathering every day, but they were able to take up different jobs. These are different jobs like tanning, which are people that work with leather that's made from animal hide. And then they were able to become blacksmiths and artisans and have all these other different jobs going on instead of just worrying about food 24/7. So this also led to political and social organizations. It led to different levels of a hierarchy within social classes. And then the city-states. The city-states were the independent nations that would try to take over one another. So there was a few major groups that we're going to go ahead and discuss. The first one is Sumer. These are the Sumerians. After that were the Akkadians that changed the name to Akkad. And we had, after that, the Babylonians. Then the Assyrians came in, followed by the Neo-Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians kind of came in twice, and I'll explain that later on as to why they came in a second time. So first up, we have the Sumerians. They had a writing system that was the basis of what we consider writing now. They had cuneiform. And because they went ahead and they started with this a writing system, it led to having literature. So the literature that they're known for having is the Epic of Gilgamesh. An epic is a story about a hero, and he goes through all these different types of trials, and we'll go into more detail about this specific epic later on. It's actually a really good story. Then they also had astronomy. They developed a number system, and they also had organized religion. And they were a polytheistic religion, which meant that they had many different gods. It wasn't just one specific god. They actually had over 3,000 gods and demigods. They had ziggurats. This was their central monumental building. They used ziggurats for lots of different things. They used it for worshiping and shrines, but they also used it as their place of business and for officials to do their work. They had a wheel and plow system, which they used for all of their farming and their crops. This is an example of the cuneiform. And this is an example of their ziggurat. Okay, the next up are the Akkadians. So they went ahead and they were incredibly short-lived. They only were around from about 2334 to 2279 BCE. They were led by King Sargon I, and he unified Lower Mesopotamia. The way they did this, he went ahead and he conquered the Sumerians and established Akkad at this point. They also spread Mesopotamian culture through war and trade, so yay for that. But other than that, they really didn't do a whole lot, and they weren't around for very long. They did have a Semitic language, so they did have a unified language. This gave way to the Babylonians. They were soon conquered by the Babylonians around 2200 BCE. But like I said, they really didn't do a whole lot other than spreading some of their culture. Next up would be the Babylonians. They rename it, once they go ahead and take over from Akkad, they rename it Babylon, and they were led by Hammurabi. They went ahead, they did reunite Mesopotamia under his rule. They conquered Akkad and Assyria, and then they had put the north and so at this point they had the north and the south of both areas. He is credited with something incredibly huge. He created, like I said, the Babylonian Empire, and they also encouraged trade. This led to a great economic system, and he's credited with Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code is about 282 laws, and they're incredibly strict laws with very severe punishments. This is where the eye for an eye system kind of came into place. They would go ahead, and if you did something to somebody, they'd do the exact same thing to you, kind of thing. The only problem is that sometimes accidents happen, and you were still punished for those accidents just as severely as if you had done it on purpose. It also was unfair because nobility didn't have to suffer their consequences. They just had to pay a heavy fine. And they did have a patriarchal system. They weren't very women friendly to most ideals, and they were conquered and destroyed in the early 1500s BCE. So this then also gave way to the next group, which are the Assyrians. So this built up around 1400 BCE, and it's in what we consider now northern Iraq. They were very skilled warriors. They were very knowledgeable about military tactics. They were led by King Sargon II, and he ruled from about 722 to 705 BCE. And he ruled with absolute power. There was no leniency in it. He was the sole kind of authority on everything. One good thing that did come from this is that they developed a Pony Express, or the first type of Pony Express. This is kind of like an information highway through trade and through different experiences that they would have. They were able to go and outreach out to other city-states and get information, give information, and it kind of created that whole information superhighway where they were all passing out information and able to kind of create the first mail system. Nineveh was their capital, and it was one of the world's first largest libraries were there. They were defeated by the Medes and the Persians and the Scythians in 612 BCE. After this, Babylon came back into the scene under the Chaldeans. This is around 612 BCE. They were masters of mathematics and astronomy, and they were the first to identify other planets out in our solar system. The ones that they identified were Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now, this is also at the point in time where writing was developed. They all had their own writing systems, and we have three basic types of writing systems that we study in history. The first one would be pictograms. Pictograms are things like hieroglyphs. They are pictures that show meaning. The next one are ideograms, and this is like cuneiform. And cuneiform represents words or ideas. And now, finally, we have phonetics. Phonetics is what we use today. This is when sounds represent other sounds or words, and we use these to show meaning. Most languages today use phonics as the basis for their writing system. All right, so the contribution of writing that Mesopotamia created allowed for a ton of new things. One of the main things that it created was the transmission of knowledge. So, transmission of knowledge allowed us to write laws, to keep records, to encourage trade and trade records. It also produced more knowledge about farming, different farming patterns, and more information that they needed on this. Sadly, the other thing that this also added was taxes. Sorry, parents. But it did contribute to the spread of taxes. Now, the way that they did this, they wrote on wet clay with a pointed reed. So it wasn't like they had a giant rock and they just kind of chiseled away at it, because that would take forever and be ridiculous. So basically what they did is they would get wet clay out of the rivers, and when they took it out, they would go ahead and grab a pointed reed, and they would go ahead and kind of mark up little wedge-shaped symbols into the clay, and then they would just let it out to dry, and this is how it would dry up and have those little symbols in it. The only people that could write, however, were scribes, and this was a very, very small elite group of people. It wasn't everybody; not everyone can read and write. It was only the top class of people. So everyday people like farmers, traders, artisans were not able to read. It was something that it was not really a contribution of equality. Not everyone was able to do it. Only the people who had that were the most wealthy and educated had the opportunity to send their children off to school to become scribes. Scribes are people that would do this, and then later on in their lives, they would become priests and record keepers and have other official positions in their government. Their system of writing is called cuneiform, and it literally just means wedge shaped, which is kind of what their shapes look like. This also spread off to Persia and Egypt and set off their system of writing, or to have a system of writing. Now, with the cuneiform, we have no way of actually reading it. It's not like the hieroglyphs for Egypt, where we went ahead and we have a Rosetta Stone that we'll talk about later on. The Rosetta Stone is what kind of helps us to translate all the hieroglyphs that we see. We don't have anything like that for the Sumerian writing. So to us, it's just wedge shaped. Okay, so Sumerian education, writing gave way to a formalized education and schooling system. It was incredibly, incredibly complicated, and it took Sumerians years to study these things. So it wasn't something that they can go to school for a couple years and then be out about in their career. It took forever to actually understand this. So they studied for many years. Scribes are people who copied the documents, and the students were all wealthy and male. They didn't have any sort of education for the girls. Sorry, girls. But yeah, it was just all educated, wealthy males. And what these people would do, they would go ahead, they'd start off as scribes, and then later on they would have official positions. So like the elected officials in government, they would go ahead and they would start off as a scribe and then move on later in life. There's also a researcher that believes that the invention of farming is what created the gender roles, and why men were able to have all these other positions, because the men were the ones starting off with all the farming, and it kind of led women to not have farming positions. So this is where that idea came in, where men had a higher status than women because they had that role in farming and they had more positions there, and women didn't. Scribes had to participate in very, very strict training. They were punished very severely. So basically, if they had done something wrong, they broke a reed, they wrote something incorrectly, they made a mistake, they were caned. And what that means is they had kind of a thin reed kind of stick, and they were hit with that reed stick which I'm pretty sure hurts a lot. Okay, so with the education, they also taught other subjects. It wasn't just writing all the time, but the fact that they had a system for writing led them to be able to study and teach other subjects. So things like math, botany, which are plants, literature, which are the different stories and different writings, and then, of course, learning other languages. Schools in Mesopotamia also set a standard for all city state schools and even for schools today. All right, so we're going to go back really quick. Okay, so a couple other things I want to add about the writing. The writing was incredibly important because it gave us the ability to have an education. You can't have an education without writing. At that point, it would just be verbal stories. And the problem with that, it's kind of like a game of telephone where you tell somebody something, they tell somebody the same thing, or their version of the same thing, and then so on and so forth. By the time it gets to the last person, it's nowhere near the same story that the first person told, which is a problem because all of those details get changed. And if you're trying to teach somebody something, it's not that easy to pass down that information correctly and accurately. So this kind of went ahead and gave them a set standard for all of these things. And like I said, this was their standard for all city states. It gave them a good education system, and they were able to set it up so that they all had benefited from this. This kind of gave us the criteria for a well-rounded student. A well-rounded student is someone that knows all different types of things, not just how to write, but they were able to be knowledgeable in other subject areas. Now, you're probably thinking, math, what the heck did they use math for? Well, they used math for growing grain. They kept crop records, and they also wanted, if they wanted the grains to grow better than others, they would mark that down or write that down. And they would also later on use this to set up a calendar. And this led for that base 60, a base 60 system. This is where the idea that they use 60 for a lot of their basis in math. So 60 seconds, 60 minutes, things like that would go ahead and lead off to more and more things in their mathematic world. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the epic I mentioned earlier, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So an epic is a long poem, and it's centered around a hero. This is the first great work of literature that we have. And what Gilgamesh, it kind of parallels a Nippur tablet. It has a creation story. It talks about cities and rulers, and it also talks about a great flood. So to go ahead and get into this a little bit better, so after the writing system, everybody wanted to go ahead and start writing stories, which would make sense if that's what you have. You start writing whatever stories you have and onto an actual writing using a writing system. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is a mythological hero, kind of like a Mesopotamian version of Hercules. He was strong and he was big and tall, and he kind of thought he was a little too all that. So the gods kind of felt like they needed to send this creature down to put him back in his place. And when they did that, he went ahead and he fought this creature, but then later on, he became best friends with this creature. And not only did he become best friends with him, but he went on a series of adventures, kind of like how Hercules did. But they went on a series of adventures, and one of the main parts of the story was that he was trying to find eternal life and eternal youth. He didn't want to grow old. He didn't want to die. And that's part of his adventure and his journey. And he learned how to cope with that through this system, through his adventures. So he faced some really crazy adventures with his best friend, learned some valuable lessons, and we'll discuss this a little bit more in class with an activity. But it's a really great story, and it's actually really interesting. So this story was written in a 6-column tablet. It tells the story of creation of human and animals and cities and rulers, and it talks about a great flood. You're probably thinking, why is the Great Flood such an important ordeal? And it's actually kind of creepy because this goes ahead and there's other religions and other civilizations that we're going to cover that all mention a great flood, and they all tie in together. And later on, you are going to notice, please pay close attention to religion and the things that these different civilizations believe, because all of it ties in together into actual factual events that they all experienced. So you'll see later on, it all kind of like plays on itself. Okay, so their religion. So the next thing you're probably wondering is why all these different city states all decided to have all kind of the same religion. They had all the same things, and why did everybody ended up believing the same things? Well, it's because of all that war and the cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is that they shared the ideas through war and trade. Since they kept meeting up with people, they kept having conversations with people and sharing their culture, it spread to having the same type of religion. They had the ziggurats, and the ziggurats were their place of worship, but it was also their place of business and government relations. They were polytheistic. They had over 3,600 gods and demigods, a god, being their main person for that type of natural event. But a demigod, they had a bunch of demigods, and these are people who were kind of like half gods. They didn't necessarily have to be literally a half god, like when we talk about Greek and Roman mythology, but they could have also just been people that were given godlike status after they had accomplished something in their lives. Now, some of the prominent gods that we'll talk about are listed down below. You don't have to write any of these down, but just so that you kind of have an idea of these type of gods. One of them you might kind of sort of be familiar with is Ishtar, and she was the goddess of fertility and life. And the reason you kind of might know who she is because she was displayed as a two-tailed mermaid, which a certain type of coffee company likes to use for their logo. And so, I mean, later on, it did get kind of the way that they explain it, it sounds like a siren, which is kind of like where they got their symbol from. And these are pictures, a real life picture of a ziggurat and a drawn picture of a ziggurat. And that's the end of this. We're going to go ahead and we'll talk a little bit more about things like the Epic of Gilgamesh in class and work on the other activities we have. And that's it.